It is morally permissible for victims to use deadly force as a deliberate response to repeated domestic violence. The resolution questions the moral permissibility of an action. An action is morally permissible if there is no moral prohibition on that action. Joseph Raz clarifies, a person is permitted to perform an action if it is not the case that he ought to refrain from it. This is the best interpretation of permissibility because it's most consistent with common usage. For example, we would say that an act is legally permissible if there is no law that prohibits it. In the same way, an act is morally permissible if there is no moral prohibition on that action. As such, in order to prove the resolution false, my opponent needs to justify a moral prohibition on the action in question. Absent that, the resolution would be understood as true, and you would vote affirmative. I value morality because the resolution is a question of what is moral. As humans, we are morally unique agents in that we possess both rationality and the motivation to pursue our desires. The combination of these factors necessitates an ends-based conception of morality. As humans, we rationally deduce our desires based on a number of external and internal influences. In addition, we are given motivation to act on our desires due to our understanding that we're not going to be around forever. The combination of these two factors necessitates an understanding of morality that centers on the consequences of the actions that we take. It's important to note that this doesn't say anything about the content of morality. My argument is that what is morally significant is not the intent or means of an action, but rather the end states that action produces. Any other system of morality is inconsistent with our nature as humans. This leads us to ask the question of how we go about maximizing our unified desire of happiness. David Gautier explains the dilemma in the form of an example. My crops will be ready for harvesting next week, yours 2 weeks from now. Each of us will do better if we harvest together than if we harvest alone. You will help me next week if you expect that in return, I shall help you in a fortnight. Suppose you do help me. I have gained what I wanted, your assistance. Absent other not directly relevant factors, helping you is now a pure cost to me. To be sure, if I were to help you, I should still be better off than had I harvested alone and not helped you. But I should be even better off still if, having received your help, I did not return it. If my reasons for deciding what to do are taken directly from my aim, then since my life will do better for me if I do not help you, this is what I have most reason to do. Essentially, an unrestrained pursuit of happiness as a moral objective creates a situation in which various moral parties have no reason to honor their agreements. At first, this seems to be perfectly acceptable, given that morality is ends-based. However, Gautier too explains why this end state is not desirable. The scenario I have sketched is one each of us can sketch, and each of us knows it to be true. So, you know I would not return your help, and being no sucker, will therefore leave me to harvest my crops alone. Neither of us will assist the other, and so each of us will do worse than need be. We shall fail to gain the potential benefits of cooperation. As such, what is necessary is to have some means by which we can restrict the actions of individuals such that self-interest is maximized. Therefore, the value criterion is adherence to rational contractarianism. Rational contractarianism is defined as those principles that self-interested individuals would allow to constrain their actions with the belief that doing so is going to serve their self-interest. Essentially, rational contractarianism is a means of alleviating the problem that Gautier identifies. Namely, that absent constraints, society as a whole is worse off if individuals selfishly pursue their own desires. Instead, under a contractarian view, individuals agree to limit their own actions with the understanding that others will do the same, thus maximizing their self-interest. So, with the understanding that rational contractarianism is the best moral framework, it's necessary to understand how contractarianism generates permissions and prohibitions. Agents tacitly enter into contractual agreements with each other all the time. For example, I may benefit from stealing from others because doing so increases my personal wealth. However, I know that if I were to do so, those individuals would retaliate, leaving us both in a worse position than we'd started. Instead, the most beneficial thing for all parties is to agree to restrict our action, i.e. by not stealing, and in return, we accept that those around us will do the same. Therefore, my burden as the affirmative debater is simply to demonstrate that acts of repeated domestic violence violate the contract present between the two agents in question. As such, the thesis and the sole contention of the affirmative case is that repeated domestic violence violates the rational contract between agents, making deadly force a morally permissible response. Subpoint A. acts of repeated domestic violence represent the domination of one agent over another. This domination stems from a foundational violation of rational contractarianism, namely, that one agent has refused the limitations on their actions and chosen to act solely out of self-interest. The abuser has forsaken the limitations placed on them by the tacit contractual agreement between themselves and the abused, and has instead decided to exercise their power over the other party in an attempt to assert themselves as dominant. As such, the abused no longer has a contractual obligation to their abuser, and any response would be morally permissible. Subpoint B. Rational contractarianism cannot prohibit action outside the context of mutual benefit. Gautier 3 concludes. A contractarian does not assume any fundamental concern with impartiality, but only a concern derivative from the benefits of agreement, and those benefits are determined by the effect that each person can have on the interests of her fellows. Only beings whose capacities are roughly equal can expect to find cooperation beneficial. Among unequals, one party may benefit most by coercing the other, and on our theory would have no reason to refrain. Only within the context of mutual benefit can our condemnation appeal to a rationally grounded morality. As such, there can exist no moral prohibition on the action of the resolution because that action exists outside the context of a contractual system. Under contractarianism, parties have to be considered equally. Otherwise, the terms of the contract become skewed. The relationship in question, i.e. the one between abused and abuser, is obviously not one characterized by equality. So, to summarize, my advocacy is as follows. An action is morally permissible if it's not prohibited. Moral prohibitions are determined by the system of rational contractarianism, and in the context of the resolution, that system is unable to provide a prohibition on deadly force. As such, because there is no prohibition, the action is morally permissible, and you vote affirmative. I am now open for cross-examination. Yeah.
What motivates our desires?
Well, contractarianism doesn't really speak to that because it doesn't really matter. Whatever motivates our desires, the best way to maximize those desires is by working cooperatively.
Okay, so your explanation of morality is that we have to look to a moral system that accounts for people's interests and people's desires. Why is that necessarily true?
Well, I would say that any moral system accounts for those desires. As humans, there are two things unique about us that separate us from animals, right? A, we set our desires. For example, I considered it, and obviously these individuals considered it, valuable for me to go to TDC this year, right? So I exercised that goal, I achieved that goal.
Okay,
In
so
addition,
we act upon our desires, right?
Sure.
Okay, so what happens when that tacit agreement between mutual benefit is broken?
In that case, there would be no moral prohibition on an action.
Where is that,
There would not be moral
where is that
judgment.
explained in the framework under the value of morality?
Where is what explained?
Where is it explained that once a tacit agreement is broken, that it's a free-for-all, any action is allowable?
So if the contract has been broken, contractualism no longer applies. It would not make sense for us to then generate a moral prohibition.
Okay, and
The moral system no longer exists.
okay, and contractualism sets up the moral framework, correct?
Right.
So how do we say that it's morally permissible without a moral framework at that point?
In the same way that something would be legally permissible if there is no law prohibiting it.
Okay, so let's look to the contention one subpoint B analysis. Can you please
Sure.
explain what you mean by a rational,
Sure. So subpoint B is the Gautier 3 analysis. That explains that there are certain situations in which rational contractarianism does not apply, in which we can't make moral judgments. And those situations are ones in which there is not a mutual benefit between parties, one in which there is one party that is obviously dominant over the other. The problem in those situations is that we can't generate a contract that's beneficial to both parties because one individual is dominating the other, so the contract is obviously going to be in their favor. So in those situations, we would not make a moral judgment.
So if the idea of contractarianism is based upon the fact that people would want to act on mutual benefit,
Sure.
and the analysis at the bottom of the AC explains how some people break those agreements, how does it hold true that mutual benefit is the best way to look towards a moral standpoint?
So my argument is just that if we both act together cooperatively, then we both reach an end that we are both happy with. If one person violates that contract, then obviously we're going to be unhappy. That's why contractualism is the correct moral system.
Okay.
That's why we have to abide by that contract. That's why it's a moral system.
Can you please explain the justification in Gautier 1?
Sure. So the Gautier 1 analysis is just explaining the dilemma that Gautier sees. Namely, that if I just act solely out of self-interest, I'm going to do things that are going to harm others. Now, say I don't care about you. That's fine. Even if that's the case, you know that I'm going to act out of self-interest, so in that instance, you would refuse to help me. The only way for us both to receive help from the other is to have some assurance that we're not going to betray the other person, which is what contractualism provides.
Great. So now Kelsey's going to take some time to prepare her next speech. But in the meanwhile, we'll talk a little bit about what just happened. So let's start with the basic ideas they're arguing about. So what is the topic under? So what topic are they debating? Right here. On to attack Brian's case. So you should have a section reserved for writing down what Kelsey's case is going to be, and then be ready to write down responses to Brian's case.
I negate. The value is morality. Actions are a reflection of the moral principles of an individual agent, because agents act on what they believe to be moral. To say that something is morally permissible would mean to say that such an action is consistent with what a moral being would do. Hence, questions of morality are questions of how individuals should act. Moral individuals should act to value life. Life entails an individual's inherent worth, that is, the value an individual has by virtue of living. This value is not contingent on the external benefits one can produce by living. Rather, the very fact that one is alive grants them this worth. The idea that individuals are morally significant beyond being used as means holds true for two reasons. First, all individuals value themselves for the sake of their being. To say that one has value because they are capable of producing a benefit external to the individual themselves would mean that their moral regard ends at the point where their usefulness ends. However, individuals do not recognize themselves in this manner. Our understanding of the way individuals view themselves is important for our understanding of morality, since morals serve as guides for individuals, and a self-conception is what compels individuals to moral action. Rather than people recognizing themselves as being morally significant only if they are useful, the worth of an individual is produced from within, making the person the end and not the means. Thus, the recognition of one's own self-worth entails the recognition of other individuals' worth, since all individuals share certain moral capacities. Second, the idea of human inviolability is consistent and universal in that it prescribes what actions are moral, regardless of particular circumstances. Moral guides must be consistent and universal, or else they solely rely on the different experiences of individuals. If morality were to be subjective and only look to each individual's experience, then it would lack the uniformity necessary to govern action, that is, prescribe how individuals should treat one another. Individuals use moral guides as mechanisms for action, so a universal mechanism is necessary for a guide to be useful in assigning moral good. Thus, the standard is preserving human inviolability. Human inviolability is the idea that human life cannot be violated, regardless of the benefit that such violation would produce. That is, we must evaluate the morality of an action based on whether the agent is respecting the value individuals have by virtue of being human. There are two reasons why killing an abuser would not respect the inviolability of individuals. First, life is a source of inviolability. Life gives individuals the opportunity to experience goods. The restrictions in moral norms protect the individual from being denied those goods. When we deem something immoral, we place a moral boundary on what an individual can and cannot still do to be considered moral. Any action that denies life is not morally permissible because it is violating the foundation of the inviolable status of humans. Deadly force is a specific example of this kind of violation because the killer is threatening the life of another individual. Second, a deliberate attack on life asserts one's disregard for the inviolability of life. Greaves explains. Intention can relate identical behavior in quite different ways to our moral attitude, and to the self being created through our moral attitude. If one intends to kill another, he accepts the identity of killer as an aspect of his moral self. If he is to be a killer through his own self-determination, he must regard himself in any situation as the lord of life and death. The good of life must be rated as immeasurably valuable, not as immeasurably dignified. When a person kills, they establish their role in the life of another person. The killer plays the role of the decider of who can and cannot have a life, thereby asserting a claim on the moral significance of that person. This claim is inconsistent with the self-view the killer has of himself. The killer deliberately violates the individual's inviolable status while simultaneously claiming an inviolable status of the same sort. Thus, a deliberate act against life, like deadly force, cannot preserve human inviolability because of the contradictory role the killer plays in the life of the individual. Now let's go on to the AC. On the topic of the AC, Woodby explains his interpretation of moral permissibility. My opponent claims that moral permissibility simply means that there's no moral prohibition on the action. However, It still must hold true that in order for the affirmative to prove moral permissibility, it has to have some sort of moral framework that governs what to do after a violation has occurred to that prohibition. He tries to claim that something that is legally permissible happens after a legal boundary has been broken. However, there are still laws that govern what happens after that boundary has been broken. Now go on to the value of morality. Under his value of morality, his Godier 1 analysis, he explains that we have to look to a moral code that governs our motives and desires. But first, we can't account for situations where mutual benefit is impossible. The situations exist where individuals help one another because they realize that mutual benefit isn't always going to be possible at the moment. This means that his ethical code will only account for situations that occur where individuals will always be mutually beneficial. However, it doesn't account for situations where individuals will not always be able to achieve a mutual benefit for performing certain good deeds. Second, his analysis assumes that character and intentions can be definitively determined. This means that if we only look to a certain moral code that acts on the interests and desires of individuals, this assumes that individuals' desires are transparent and we can always determine whether or not their desires or their reasons for acting are going to be the true reasons that they're acting. This is important because if we can't determine whether or not those interests are for the mutual benefit or because of that mutual benefit, his theory doesn't hold true that we have to be acting on mutual benefit. Now going to the Godier 2 analysis. On the Godier 2 analysis, he explains that cooperation is necessary because we must restrict the different types of actions we can take against one another. But the problem with this is that interests can change at different times. This means that his moral guide for action isn't going to guide individuals at the point where their interests are changing. We need a moral guide that can account for changing different interests, because in order to be universal, in order to be applicable, and to create a fair way of determining how we should act toward one another, the guide must be consistent. That's explained under the second point on the NC. Now going to the value criterion of adhering to rational contractualism. The first problem with contractualism is the fact that it's a tacit agreement. He tries to explain this argument under the value criterion by saying tacit agreements happen all the time, i.e. we don't steal because we believe that other people will steal from us and that would be a bad situation. However, he's once again assuming that all people would agree to a tacit agreement to not steal and not act on their own benefit. But second of all, I would say that this response to contractualism is going to be inconsistent with our view of ourselves. There's no justification for why interests have to play a role in morality in the first place. And if he's not providing a reason why we have to look to individuals' interests, then it's not going to be consistent with the self-view that is going to actually compel us to follow these moral guides. Now go on to the contention 1 level. On the contention 1, he explains that repeated domestic violence is a broken contract between the abuser and the victim, and this means that the victim can act on this any way they can choose. The problem with this is that his account of morality appeals to a value of morality without prescribing a different moral code that happens after contractualism is broken. Remember, contractualism never tells you what can happen after the tacit agreement is broken. It simply says that it can be permissible, but he still needs a moral framework for it.
Okay, ready? So the premise of the negative case is that life is a source of inviolability, right?
Correct.
Okay, are there other sources of inviolability?
I would say life is a primary source of inviolability.
So what about the individual that is being abused? Are they inviolable?
I would say that their claim to inviolability is
It's
applicable.
weaker?
No, it's applicable for the same reason the abuser's claim to inviolability is applicable.
Okay, so then why can't they assert themselves? Why can't they assert their claim to inviolability? Why don't they have that right?
The reason why they can't assert their claims to inviolability is because that would create a contradiction of why they're claiming that inviolability in the first place. The reason why they're claiming that inviolability is because they're living and they have certain inherent worth. But to say that their inherent
Sure.
worth is more valuable at
But
that
you
point,
acknowledge that one individual in this situation is going to be violated, right?
yes, I acknowledge that, but I also acknowledge
So-
the fact that
So
your analysis
why is it okay that the abuser is violated, or rather that the abused is violated, but not the abuser?
I'm not justifying domestic violence in any way, and I'm not trying to say that it's okay that that violation occurs.
Right,
I'm simply
but
saying
you
that your moral
acknowledge-
framework doesn't account for what
Sure.
happens after that violation.
Oh, absolutely.
And if we were to account for that,
But
that
you
would mean
acknowledge that
individuals could be
you acknowledge that a
inviolable.
violation will occur.
I acknowledge
right?
that the violation does occur, yes.
So is it okay that that violation is happening? Is it moral?
No, it is not moral, but it wouldn't be moral for the victim to act in a manner that would violate the life of another.
Okay, that's fine. Let's talk about the value criterion. The value criterion is respecting inviolability, right? What does that mean?
Okay, that simply means that we have to preserve the fact that each individual has inherent worth, and that
Where does that worth come from?
That word comes from the very fact that the person is an individual and that the person has that life source. That
Right, but where does that come from? Why does the fact that we have life mean that we have worth? Surely there's a source of that worth.
Okay, yeah. The source of that worth is simply the fact that we're living beings. And if we are living beings, that means that...
What is it about us as living beings that gives us worth?
I would say the same reason why you're claiming the victim can act in the preservation of their life because their life is meaningful is the same reason why I'm saying life is
because
violent.
they determine their desires rationally, right?
No, I don't agree with that part. I
Okay.
simply agree with the part that...
So do you value a human the same way you would value any other life form, like an amoeba or something?
No, I would only value a
Okay,
human.
awesome. So what is it unique about humans that gives us worth?
I would say it's unique because we have the ability to pursue our own life.
Awesome, we have the ability to set ends, right? Okay, fantastic. Let's talk about the contention that goes into the case.
Okay.
So there's two parts, right? The first says that life is a source of inviolability,
Yes.
right? What does that mean? Just that
Okay.
we have to be alive in order for us to maximize our inviolability, something like that?
Sure. That means that with life, we're able to pursue goods. And so in order to maintain that pursuit of goods, we have to respect the fact that individuals have inherent worth.
Okay, but respecting that worth doesn't necessarily mean that that inviolability is being pursued, right? It just allows that to happen.
Yeah,
Okay,
it's necessary for viability to be respected.
Cool. So before...
Is everybody ready? Start by extending the RAS definition at the top of the affirmative case. That says that an act is morally permissible if there is no moral prohibition on that action. Now, this conflicts with Kelsey's interpretation of permissibility at the top of the negative case, but there are two reasons you're going to be preferring my interpretation. First, the example I give in the affirmative case still makes a lot of sense. We say that something is legally permissible if there is no law that prohibits it. In the same way, something is morally permissible if there is no moral rule that would prohibit it. Second, her interpretation just doesn't make sense. Under her interpretation, we would have to have an infinite number of moral rules that would tell us how we should act. That doesn't make any sense. My interpretation says we can act in any way we please so long as there is not a moral rule prohibiting it. So, what this means is all I have to do is prove that there is no moral prohibition on the act in question, and I win the round. So, next, extend the value of morality because the resolution is a moral question. Then extend the argument directly under that, which says that morality has to be ends-based because we, as humans, set our own goals, and we only have a limited amount of time in which we can pursue those goals. Kelsey agrees to this in cross-examination. She says, yes, what's special about us as humans, where our worth comes from, is the fact that we set our own goals. This is going to be hugely significant because it means that the NC is not going to matter so long as the affirmative case still establishes the best end state for protecting those desires. Then, extend Gautier 1. Gautier 1 explains the dilemma with morality, namely, that if we were all concerned with solely our own interests, we would act selfishly. Then, extend Gautier 2. That explains why contractarianism solves that for that problem. Essentially, because contractarianism forces us to act not out of self-interest, but rather to maximize everyone's self-interest community. So, what this means is that you can extend the value criterion of rational contractarianism. That means that an act is morally permissible if there is no moral prohibition under rational contractarianism. So, my argument is simply this. Under rational contractarianism, under rational contractarianism, there are two parties. If a violation happens under rational contractarianism, if the contract is violated, there's no more moral system, and that would lead to a lack of moral prohibition. So, at this point, all I have to do is prove that there is no moral prohibition on the action of the resolution by proving that there has been a violation in the contract. But first, let's talk about some of Kelsey's responses to the framework. Her first response says that there's some situations where it's impossible. But one, those situations are non-moral. Second, there can be other systems that aren't morality that would tell us what we should do in those situations. Then she says that this assumes intentions. But this doesn't matter. My argument doesn't care what their motivations are as long as they have motivations. Her final argument is that those interests can change. But first, contracts can account for that because contracts can change as well. Second, very rarely is someone's interest going to include being the victim of domestic violence. That doesn't make any sense. So now, let's extend some offense from the affirmative case. I only have to extend one piece of offense and I will win the round. Start with subpoint A, extend it. That says that the abuser has forsaken their limitations. They are acting purely out of self-interest without any regard for the individual that's being abused. her only response is that I'm not prescribing a code that would take place after contractualism. There's absolutely no conflict with the affirmative case here. There's no reason that she can provide that. So, that's all I need to win the round. Let's talk about the negative case. Go down to her justifications for the value criteria. Start with the first one. One, I'd say that even if this is true, contracts recognize this. In fact, contracts say if we value ourselves, we have to act under contracts because that allows everyone to achieve their self-interest. Second, this has nothing about the pursuit of those ends, which is what contractualism allows to occur. Then go to the second justification. First, I'd say that contracts are the only means by which we can maintain universality insofar as contracts are universal. They're understood by everyone. And second, there's absolutely no means of determining what it means for something to be universal, so even if this argument was true, it's not a means by which you can adjudicate the debate.
Cool. So that was the first affirmative rebuttal. Then Kelsey's going to give one, and then Brian will give one more.
Verifying what needs to be more information that's at the top, and then I'll put science from there. So I'll explain where I'm going from there. I agree that all I have to prove is that there's a moral prohibition. You can grant him the analysis that moral permissibility simply means that there's no moral prohibition. I'll show the prohibition through my own framework. Let's look there now. Go to under the value morality on the NC. Go to the part where I explain, at the top of the NC, where I explain that moral individuals are those who value life because of the fact that life is a source of inherent worth. And that if we're looking to this type of inherent worth, this means that the best way that we can view morality is through whether or not it's consistent with how individuals would view themselves, because people do not view themselves as only useful as a means, but rather useful as the ends. This means that his analysis on the top of the AC, which explains how I agree that it must be end-based, doesn't address the fact that if we're looking to the source of inherent worth, that we have to view people as the means to that end, and not necessarily being used to that end. So that is not necessarily being used to that end, excuse me. So that means that we're looking to individuals having inherent worth. At the point where we agree that individuals have inherent worth, we now have to look to why my framework is going to be preferable in protecting that inviolability, like he tries to claim that he does as well. The first justification for that is the fact that we have to look to, go to the second justification. That explains how we have to look to a universal guide of morality. The fact that I'm saying that all individuals have inherent worth, irregardless of the benefits produced and violating that inherent worth, means that my guide is going to be consistent and provide a consistent guide as to how individuals can treat one another. This guide is going to be preferable to his for that very reason. He claims that once you go to his response to my second argument, or my third argument, that interest can change on his AC Godier 2 analysis. Then he tries to claim that contrast can change as well, but that's the very problem that I'm speaking to on my second justification for the value or for my interpretation of morality. At the point where contrast can change, this means that we don't have a universal guide as to how we can consistently treat one another. And insofar as morality is supposed to guide our actions in treating one another, we won't be able to determine that once contracts can always change. That's going to be the first reason why you're referring back to interpretation of value morality. That is the reason links me back to my value criterion of preserving human inviolability, because I'm explaining how with inherent worth, we have to look to individuals as being the only as being the ends in themselves. This means that life cannot be violated regardless of the benefits of doing so. So even though he's trying to claim his answer to my value analysis that the contract has been broken and therefore he's better protecting the viability because he's allowing the victim to defend themselves, this is going to be violating the fact that individuals have inherent worth, because he's saying that the benefit of protecting the victim is demonstrating the fact that they're inviolable. So that links to the contention 2 analysis on the MC. The contention 2 agrees with analysis explains how the killer is asserting their own justification asserting their own role in the life of the individual that they're violating. So by allowing the victim to kill their abuser, they're rather saying that they're the decider of who can and cannot have this inherent worth that I'm speaking to. And insofar as he's trying to link back to my standard of preserving human inviolability, he cannot do so because of the contention 2 analysis, which explains that we can't say that someone is inviolable and yet try and insert our own role in deciding who is and is not inviolable. That's the first reason why you're buying the NC as well. That goes along with the first justification for why you're buying the NC. Now go back to the AC. On the AC, if he's not winning the fact that, if he's not defending the fact that I'm proving a prohibition by the very fact that my agreement is providing a consistent guide, then he can't be linking back to his argument on the contention one analysis. But let's go back to the answer to the value criterion. Go to the answer on the value criterion where I explain how tacit agreements can be broken because people don't always stick to the agreements that they make with one another. This means that his agreement is based on the fact that it will be permissible because all individuals would want to agree to a mutually beneficial agreement. However, he's not accounting for how individuals would not always stick to that agreement, meaning that there's going to be a sort of leeway for individuals to violate one another after that tacit agreement is broken, which is what he's trying to justify in the case. This is going to be detrimental to how he's trying to link back to his value criterion of adhering to rational contracts, because the reason why he's trying to adhere to that contract is to try to preserve the value of the victim's life himself. This means that if he's trying to preserve the value of the victim's life while violating the value of the other individual's life, he's not going to be showing how that agreement is going to be mutually beneficial, which is what his contractarianism is going to be contingent on. So, as a brief overview of how the round is going to break down for the negative side. The reason why the negative is clearly winning its framework on why there's a moral prohibition is coming from the fact that we have inherent worth. If individuals have inherent worth, that means that they can't be violated, i.e. looking to the value criterion of preserving human viability, because of the fact that that inherent worth is a consistent guide for how we have to look to individuals and how individuals must act towards one another. Even though he's going to try and claim that he's linking into this by saying that contracts are going to be universal, he's not going to be linking to this because of the analysis coming on the third argument on the AC that explains how interest can change, that is not going to be a universal guide. That universal guide is important because individuals have to have some sort of agreement on how to treat one another. He's also going to try and explain how he can be protecting their viability because individuals are going to be treated as ends, and we have to look to ends-based criteria. However, this is not going to be pertaining to whether or not individuals are able to achieve that ends, i.e. we need to respect them for their viable status in order for that ends to be made possible. So you're going to be preferring the NC because I'm protecting the source of that inviolability.
Okay. So
Directly under the value. Extend my argument, which goes unanswered, saying that morality is necessarily ends-based because we as humans have the ability to set our own ends to pursue those ends. Remember, in cross-examination, she agrees with this argument. She says that what's really important, what gives us human worth, is our ability to pursue our own ends. That's going to have two implications. A, the individual that wins this round is the individual whose moral system best allows us to realize those ends. I'm going to contend, or rather, my argument will be that contractualism is the best way of doing that. Second, this means that the inviolability of life arguments in the negative case no longer matter because life is not what is inviolable. Instead, what is inviolable is our ability to set those goals and pursue them as moral agents. So, if I can prove that contractualism best maximizes that, that's going to be a justification as to why the affirmative will win the round. But before I do that, very quickly go to the negative case. She extends this argument from the top to the negative case, where she says that life is the source of worth. But remember, she clarifies this in cross-examination. She says that life is not the source of worth. The source of worth is our ability to set goals and pursue those goals. So if I'm going to be the one showing you that contractarianism allows us to maximize that pursuit, that's a reason to vote affirmative. With that in mind, you can extend the value out of the affirmative case, i.e. the value of morality, the resolutions of moral question. Then extend the Gautier 1 analysis. That explains what the dilemma with morality is. Namely, that if I act purely out of self-interest, I'm going to do things that are going to harm me later down the road and that harm the communal self-interest. Then extend Gautier 2. He explains why contractarianism solves that problem. Contractarianism forces us to act in the interest of others, and by doing so, act in our own self-interest in the long run. So, with that in mind, you can extend the value criterion of rational contractarianism. So, at this point, all I have to do is prove that the contract in the world of the affirmative, in the world of the resolution, is broken. If the contract is broken, in that scenario, there would no longer be a moral prohibition on the action of the resolution, which as per the RAS definition that she's conceding at the top of the affirmative case, is sufficient to vote affirmative. So, with that in mind, read from the subpoint A out of the affirmative case, which says that the individual, i.e. the abuser, has forsaken the limitations on them imposed by the contract and has instead decided to act purely out of self-interest. She's not addressing this in her last speech. Her only other response on the affirmative case comes from the value criteria, i.e. she says that agreements can be broken. Even if that is the case, I say that's non-moral. My argument is that this is what individuals should do, not necessarily what they will do. Even if her argument here is true, it does not speak to the power of morality or to what morality actually consists of. Then, go to the negative case. Really quickly on the universality argument. Read from my second response to universality says that there's no means of determining whether or not a moral system is universal, which means that even if I'm losing the universality argument, she's never justifying why universality matters or specifying what it means for a moral system to be universal, at which point that argument is no longer relevant.
So, now we're going to talk a little bit about Ryan's speech, and then I'm going to give you guys time to think about the round on your own. So, let's start with the idea of morality that Ryan was going for in the last speech. So, he's framing most of his argument around this one central idea about morality. And what is the idea about morality that he starts his speech with, that he says is going to be the most important thing and exclude the negative case and allow him to win the round? It's about what morality says is valuable.
Goals?
Yeah, you guys both said it in different ways, goals or ends. So what Brian said is, based on his case, based on what he said in his last speech, the most important thing, according to morality, is that we can pursue our goals. We can pursue our interests and our ends. All of us are interested in the things that we want, and thus, that's what morality has to protect. So that is the key idea about morality that he uses to say that contracts are valuable, because in order for us to pursue our ends and goals and interests, we have to enter into a mutually agreeable contract with one another. You have a question?
Yeah, would a victim's goal be to, is that what he's saying? That a victim's goal would be to get out of that abuse? Therefore, that's why he or she would be able to, reply or respond to the abuse?
So it's a little different than that. So let's talk about the argument that Brian was going for in the end.
Okay.
So what he's talking about is about the victims versus the abuser's goals, but it's a little different than that. So he's saying, if you can move to the part of your notes where you have his explanation for why the situation of domestic violence affects the moral system that he's advocating. So what he says is we have to enter into this mutually agreeable contract, and then what does he say happens to the contract in the situation where one person is dominating another?
It's broken.
Right, there is no contract specifically. Because it's broken, there is no contract. So what he's saying is, because the victim has ends, and because the abuser has goals and interests, if the abuser says, well, I'm just going to pursue mine no matter what this other person thinks, that means he's abandoning a contract. That means that the system that was giving us morality goes away. That means it's permissible to respond in whatever way, because there's no more moral rules to say, don't do that. So that's the idea that he's going for. So it is related to the victim's goals and interests, but it's not directly because the victim doesn't want that it occurs. It's because the victim doesn't want a system where their interests aren't generally respected.
Okay.
Cool. So now what I want is for you guys to take a little bit of time and find some empty space on your sheet of paper. And what you're going to do is you're going to decide who you think won the round. And here are the things that you should keep in mind when you're doing that. So remember, in order to win, the person has to set up their arguments by talking about what morality means. So Brian has an idea about what morality means, which is people enter into these mutually agreed contracts. And Kelsey has an idea about what morality means, which is you have to always respect each individual, and no individual can ever be violated, so no individual can be killed. So think about who is setting up the better idea of morality, and then think about whether they're showing why the situation in the resolution with an abuser and a victim links into that idea of morality. And in Brian's case, if you think that Brian won, it means it's because you think that he's shown, based on his idea of morality, that it's okay for the victim to kill the abuser. And if you think that Kelsey won, it's because you think that she has shown, based on her idea of morality, that it is prohibited to kill the abuser. So take a couple minutes and write down, and be sure to mention both the notion of morality and how that applies to the situation of the resolution.